I'm cheating.
I'd like to welcome you back to our last session on some lessons of the crisis, especially lessons from developing countries for the United States. First, a couple of announcements. To the current CDE students, you should be worried because you don't have your tickets for tonight. So you're going to need your ticket to the lecture tonight, and I guess Rachel and Karima will be outside in the lobby of the 62 Center with your tickets. So you've got to find one of them in order to get into the talk. While I'm speaking of them, I know that some people are leaving so early they're not going to make it to the dinner. Others are not going to make it to the breakfast tomorrow morning. So I wanted to take this opportunity to thank the many people who've worked on this to organize it. First, Anand Swamy, Tom Powers, Henry Bruton, who's not at the last session, though he'll be back for the talk tonight, were the organizing committee to put this together. We had great help from Peter Montiel, others in the economics department. You've seen the work that Pam and Susan have been doing to make these days flow well together, along with Rachel and Karima. So I would definitely like to thank them. And if I could mention them in order of proportionate importance in terms of just the hours that they spend on it, I'd be saying Tom's name over and over again because he spent so much time putting this together. So sincere thanks. So now on to crises, which we've heard a little bit about before. In the last 100 to 150 years, societies have been trying to regulate the financial system and actually other parts of their economy. They've achieved a fair amount of success, say in regulating the food industry or the aviation industry, because although there are occasionally outbreaks of poisoning or airplane crashes, those two industries are a lot safer than they were 100 or 150 years ago. I wish I could say the same thing about the financial system. Unfortunately, regulation has not achieved quite as much. One way that we can do better is by learning lessons from each other, which is what this seminar is about, or this discussion is about. It was not popular during the U.S. crisis to discuss crises in other countries and what lessons we could draw from them. But since the U.S. was so very free with its advice when other countries have crises, I thought it was appropriate to turn the tables around a little bit. We have a very distinguished panel to speak with us this afternoon. Their very extended biographies are posted on the CDE website, but let me introduce them briefly in the order that they're going to speak in. Mauricio Yepez from the CDE class of 1982 served as Ecuador's Minister of Finance and Economy from 2004 to 2005. Before that, he held a number of high posts, including being the president of the Central Bank of Ecuador. He also served with the International Monetary Fund. He will give us an overview of some of the issues related to the resolution of the crisis from a developing country perspective, which I hope will be picked up in our discussion. Senior Minister Chok Tong from the CDE class of 1967 held many high-level posts in Singapore, serving as chairman of the Monetary Authority of Singapore, regarded as one of the best-run central banks in the world. Prior to becoming Prime Minister of Singapore in 1990, a position that he held for about 14 years. He's going to speak to us especially about the knock-on effects of the U.S. crisis in East Asia and some of the policy responses that were taken by those governments. Last and not least is Jack Wadsworth from the Williams undergraduate class of 1961. Jack, as many of you know, has extensive experience in the markets with an especially deep background in Asia. He was in Morgan Stanley's, heading up Morgan Stanley's Tokyo office from 1987, and then in 1992 moved on to Hong Kong, where he oversaw their Asian operations. He's also been involved with setting up a venture capital fund in firm in Beijing. So it's hard to find anybody with more in-depth experience in the capital markets than Jack. He's going to talk to us some about China, their role as an emerging power, and I hope he will shed some light on the issue that is occupying a lot of discussion today, and that is China headed for another crisis in which a lot of us better start worrying, or need we not be concerned about that? Before I turn the floor over to these experts, I just want to make a few comments. Don't have to say anything about the seriousness of the financial crisis in the United States. We actually haven't had the worst effects of it. Countries like Ireland that have seen a 20% drop in their GDP have had it even worse. About a week ago, Secretary Geithner gave a speech almost declaring victory. He was speaking about the TARP program. And I guess my take on that would be to add that it's not over yet. The financial costs of the crisis, let alone the costs of unemployment and idle resources, are still out there. There's still some assets that one has to be concerned about, used to be called toxic assets and other paper, that are still sitting in the commercial banking system on the balance sheets of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, in the federal home loan banks, and even on the Fed's balance sheet. So we don't fully know the cost of that crisis yet. And that's actually also typical of many banking crises around the world, that the early estimates of costs end up being very far off the final mark. If you ask retirees in the United States who live on fixed incomes, they would be rather amazed to hear that there's not much of a cost to this crisis, because they're paying for part of the cost in terms of lower returns on their on any bond-related investments. Secondly, I guess in considering the policymakers' response to the crisis, there are a few principles that I think are worth keeping in mind and may come up in the discussion. The first principle is that it's desirable to be relatively early in intervening in crises and recognizing them, and then taking some policy actions to address them and contain them. In many cases, countries put off formally recognizing the crisis. In the U.S., we put off for years recognizing the savings and loans crisis because we didn't want to face that fiscal cost, and that's not unusual. I think one might say that we did better on that criteria in this crisis. It is actually possible for authorities to come in too soon when there's a banking crisis. It's like when you're fighting a forest fire, if you come in with gasoline to start a secondary fire to help it burn off, you really better know what you're doing. And if you come in too early, you could make the fire a lot worse. The second principle is that when you're intervening, it helps to be comprehensive. You don't want to make an announcement to the public, or actually even hint to the public, that you're dealing with part of the crisis today and you'll be back later to deal with other parts of it as need be. Because when you do that, you set up the conditions for a run on the entire system. If people are uncertain about the health of the financial sector, then they're going to retrench. Some countries have gotten into trouble with this in the past. Restructuring the banking system, restructuring the other parts of the economy that are insolvent is not a guarantee that new lending will start up quickly. But I don't know many cases in fact, I can't think of any cases of crises where that restructuring has not taken place and yet new lending has started up again in a vigorous way. That's why I wish actually we had Congressman Kang from Korea, who was going to be on this panel. He was the former Prime Minister of Korea, but he was detained by a congressional audit that he's leading in Korea. Korea did a very good job of restructuring quickly in their crisis. The third principle is that whenever intervening in crises, that authorities have to remember that even if they may not be in office when the next crisis hits, the actions that they take will have an impact on what happens in the next crisis, that they can create a moral hazard if the incentive to monitor the financial system is reduced markedly by their own actions. It's very hard for governments to get high marks on all of these criteria, but as we look back in history, the authorities that have done a better job in these areas, I think, have enjoyed, if you'll pardon the expression, a better crisis, a shorter and less costly crisis. So now let's hear from the experts to see if they either agree or disagree with these criteria or have other principles to offer in handling the crises. Mauricio, turn it over to you.
I would like to congratulate the Center for Development Economics on the 50 years of magnificent work providing its students with necessary training and tools to face the challenges of improving the economy in the developing world. I would say that also many of the alumni of the CDE have become policy makers in our countries, and I would say that some of them have achieved very successful stories. In any case, if they are not very successful, in any case, they have become a better professionals as well. Also, I want to thank Gerard for inviting me to this meeting, apart from sharing with you all these 2 days about important things of economics and issues that are very important now. It's also very nice for me to come back to Williams to visit after almost 30 years. And I share the same, like Toga mentioned before, the flavor of the CDE, and it seems that everything is equal at the Center for Development Economics. Having said that, I won't resist to talk a little bit about something that was very provocative by Professor Stiglitz yesterday. And it is about how the economics approach has been in the last, let's say, 20 years. But I think if we see the last experience of Latin America, especially of Latin America, I see that maybe the conclusions that we arrived yesterday and mainly this morning can be revisiting at least to this thing. And I will just take 2 or 3 topics about this to reaffirm my view. It's very important to see that the degree of resilience that Latin America country has shown during the last crisis. I could talk about some common characteristics of the financial crisis all over the world, but instead of giving lessons to the U.S., I will have some questions to have to see how the policy makers in the U.S. will face the enormous challenges that they have to go ahead. But beginning with the Latin America case, I will say that during the last global crisis is totally different compared with its own past and to the and also to other emerging economies. This newfound resilience reflects the steady progress made by many Latin American countries in strengthening their fiscal stance, their macro stability, microfinancial immunity, and also the degrees to maneuver. In the past, it was it was very difficult to be confident of the fiscal and monetary policies of our countries. Now, I will say that many of them have improving a lot. For instance, in the monetary stance, we have many countries applying inflation targeting, which has been very successful as a tool in our economies. And I will mention also two additional important factors that occurs in the last years. One has to be with the difference between Latin America becoming a net creditor in the debt side to the rest of the world, instead of being, as in the last 2 decades, being as a net debtor. This is a very important thing to notice, and it is very useful because a lot of management, a lot of improvement in the debt management has occurred. And also, the way the Latin American countries get into the international market. Instead of doing like with debt, we have changed a little bit, and the main feature now is that we are a creditor and also a debtor in the equity side. This is an important factor that has to be taken in account. The second thing is a growing connection to emerging Asia, and to China in particular. China matters a lot because for Latin American countries, not just because of its direct links through its demand for agricultural and mineral products, but also indirectly through the impact that China has in the international markets for commodities for which Latin America is abundant, and third country markets to which Latin America also exports. In the past, even when the initial turbulence or initial problems was completely exogenous from Latin America, as was, for instance, the case in 1999 with the Russian crisis, or the failure of the long-term, the giant hedge fund long-term capital management in the same year, the macroeconomics and financial vulnerabilities were such that the domestic effects of the external disturbance were substantially magnified in our countries. The kind of experiences gave place to the popular saying that when the U.S. gets a cold, Latin America suffers a pneumonia. It happened this time that the resilience of Latin America is totally different, and at least for this time being, we are in a better position. And it has been, as I said before, by the improving of the three traditional weaknesses that we had in Latin America. First, weak currencies. Second, weak financial and banking system. And third, a weak fiscal stance. The scope for macro policy maneuvering in these circumstances was heavily constrained, and policy responses tended to be procyclical themselves. For instance, the fear of floating the exchange rate due to the fact that the main debt in the countries were dollarized, in dollar terms, made it impossible to move the exchange rate. In that case, the central bankers used to increase the interest rate, something that Mr. Stiglitz was very against for that yesterday. But this is the only way to prevent the flight to capital to other countries. And in the same sense, if you have, as a Ministry of Finance, if you have the capital markets closed suddenly, the only way to work is or to increase taxes, or in any case to cut expenditures, even when the situation in the economy was in a bad situation, or the growth was very low. So this larger exposure to the external shocks and the magnification effects during crisis has hit the debate on the markets about financial globalization. However, sounder macroeconomic and financial policy frameworks and a shift in the Latin American region toward a safest form of international integration should be taken into account to revisiting at least the globalization debate. This is something that I needed to mention since the comments that were made yesterday. From the financial crisis with the U.S., and I would say that some questions, for instance, if they are similar to other crises around the world. There is a paper of Carmen Reinhardt saying that it looks like everything is different, but at the end, the crisis is the same here or in Latin America or in Asia when it comes to financial sectors. The second point is how to get out of the situation and going forward in the next. Well, the problem seems that financial crises always happen in an environment of macroeconomic imbalances. It has happened in Latin America, and it seems to be happening also in the US. If you see several figures that we check about federal government total revenue and expenditures, as well as the federal government gross debt in billions of US dollars, all of them shows the imbalances that the US are facing since, let's say, the last 5 or 6 years. This is the one cause of financial crisis. The second one is what Mr. Stiglitz is very concerned about, the information asymmetries and the principal agent problems. And I will say that also the weaker regulatory framework. I will say that just adding to what Gerard said, you can have in a country a very bad Minister of Finance and a very bad government, and it will cost, let's say, 4 or 5 points of GDP. In the case of a financial crisis, it costs the GDP in many cases. So this is very important that the regulatory framework will be in place to avoid this kind of situations. And we can give a lot of characteristics of a good regulatory framework, but I want to mention one that is very distinctive in the US and has to do with the salaries of the American bankers. And it's something that it seems it doesn't seem very difficult to talk about this, but it seems that at the end have a lot of problems. For instance, it appears that the compensation framework for American bankers provides the growing incentives for them, since it is not clear whether this framework works to add value to the firm in the long term, or is just designed to move the value of the stock in the short run. And the problem is that due to the current compensation framework, there is a misalignment of interests since they are rewarded for their performance in the short run. This misalignment of interest must be addressed in a way that the incentives for innovation are not affected, but at the same time, long-run investment behavior must be encouraged. some solution has to be established in the short run. Otherwise, the system won't work. I don't know if this special committee that was created by the Congress established something about this, but a solution will be to establish a fund with all these incentives have to be put there, and still for some time to see if the value added of the work is established in the long run or just in the value of the stock. And this is just to mention one of the pathetic problems that one can find in the American situation in the banking sector. The other problem that is very clear is that the excessive leverage in the banking sector, something that Basel III, I think, it will be said. But this is not the problem if the system can find the vehicle to go away from the supervision, and as Mr. Stiglitz said today, widespread the risk all over, and especially in institutions that don't have any kind of supervision. So this is the second one thing that one must take care in the American banking situation. Something will be said by, or has been established by the Basel III, but in any case, I don't see if in the US it will take too much time, because some period, it has been established in some period of time, but I think it should be done very quickly. And finally, the third point about the weak regulatory framework is the so-called too big to fail. And the problem of the too big to fail is that after the crisis, the ones that survive the crisis become even larger institutions, and with the same problem of that too big to fail and the moral hazard that we face with them. At the end of the day, all the things have to be in the budget, and the budget has to bail out the system. It's the only way to go through the problem. And in the case of the US, the difference is that the US almost has unlimited issues of paper money. So it can finance all the bailout without adjusting the economy at some point, until the point of the people want to lend money to the American government. And the curious thing is that under this situation, in the US, it happens that deflation and currency appreciation of the currency. In our countries, with a limited capacity of issuance money and to leverage or to finance the bailout, the problem has been inflation and also the devaluation of the currency with a very high social cost. And here in the US, we don't have any freezing of accounts of what we call in Latin America, and it was named in Argentina, El Corralito. So we don't have freezing of accounts, no capital flight we have seen in the US, and no harm to depositors or other creditors. Maybe some shareholders have lost the equity, but the point is who will pay the bill, and the bill has to be paid someday. So The financial system has stabilized, although Gerard told us that there are some toxic assets in the balance sheets of some institutions, but in the way it is solving is with, well, the cost of money for the banks is almost zero, and lending rates for these banks is about 5%. So if you keep this policy for 2 years more, the problem is solved, the balance sheets are very clean, and there is no problem. The banks that survived the crisis are bigger now. For instance, those that take Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs. Financing from multilateral organizations, you don't have that need. We, in Latin America, needed very much the only way to finance these problems were the multilateral organizations. And I will say that it was very helpful for us. Although the critics of against the IMF and the World Bank, as early this afternoon somebody mentioned, we are members of those clubs, and we have to take all the advantage that to be member of them. And for Latin American countries, when all the markets, all the capital markets were closed, the only source for financing was multilateral organizations. And not in the way that it was mentioned yesterday, that the minister has to wait to the mission of the IMF to see if the budget is cut in 10% or the interest rate has to be increasing 40 or 80%. No, I think that the discussions were in very good terms, trying to solve the structural problems of the countries. And I think all this work that has been done, let's say the last 20 years, like especially the last 10 years, have proven a very good results. What I mentioned before, the resilience of Latin America against this tremendous and this big crisis in the US that otherwise we, in the past, we are not able to manage. We are seeing that this is mainly because we have all the support from multilateral organizations. And the question is, okay, the financial system in the US has stabilized, the bailout has been given. When will the financial adjustment is going to start in the US? This is the big question. Somebody will argue, well, it's very difficult to start the adjustment if the economy is growing at this rate. But my point is, okay, maybe it's not today, but when is the time to start the adjustment going on? And I will put some more things that make difficult for the policymakers in the American economy to work in this sense. And the question is, a fiscal adjustment feasible considering an aging population and higher entitlements? This is the main thing that I see like a problem in the US. Because in Latin America, participation in social security system is very low, as well as unemployment benefits are very low. So we didn't have this problem during the financial crisis. The policymakers in the US have the political capital for entitlement reform when they cut programs. Is it possible to do in the US? Will they only finance the entitlements for baby boomers and introduce reforms that will affect the millennials? something has to be done with the social security system. The social security system cannot be worked as it is working now. You have to cross the line in some point and say, well, the benefits will have to change. So those are the main questions and the main challenges that American society will face in the near future. And I don't know if I just watched TV yesterday at the news, and it seems that from the political point of view, the next midterm elections will be quite against, at least what I see, quite against the government. So will the American society will have the cohesion to implement these reforms? And I will say something that maybe was very difficult to talk in the past. I was in charge of negotiating the free trade agreement with the U.S. when the president of the World Bank was in charge of that, Mr. Selig. And the main point that I was to point out was that, okay, we have free movement of goods and services. We should have a free movement of capital. And third, we should have a free movement of labor force. That is very important for all the world, not only for the U.S. And for instance, for the U.S., it's important to have coming new young workers to the economy, because the structure of the Social Security needs a very wide base to finance the aging population. So my point is that maybe it's cheaper to take care of elderly in developing countries. We have nice weather, good beaches, and productivity of the people in developing countries will increase a lot. And if we can do this as a policy, as a whole, will be benefit for both sides. I will end saying that something of this is just happening. I work in a private bank, and I used to meet with my customers, foreign customers going to Ecuador that want to buy a house, very cheaper house, very nice place in very nice locations, and they go there to stay 7-8 months a year, and then go back to the U.S. And they use the Medicare there because it's very cheaper. We have a very good physician as well, prepared in the U.S., by the way. So something of that we have to, can we work? And if there is the political cohesion in the U.S., something of this can be the solution. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mauricio.
So, Jerry, first let me thank you for inviting me back to Williams College and CDE to celebrate with you the 50th anniversary of CDE. I recall with nostalgia my time in Williams College. That's some 40 years ago. And I'm very happy to see that the college has become stronger, both the college as well as the CDE. Whilst for many of us who were here, we are not getting stronger, not physically anyway. I want to focus my remarks on how China and Singapore managed the impact of the global financial crisis, and make some observations which may be relevant to the US. China, as you know, is an emerging economy, but a huge one. In fact, it's now the world's second largest economy. Singapore, on the other hand, is a small but open economy, which is therefore very vulnerable to external events. The direct impact of the US subprime and financial crisis on the financial sector of China, Singapore, and in fact on Asia was fortunately limited. After the Asian financial crisis of 1997, 1998, Asian banks were generally well capitalized and the balance sheets were strong. The exposure to subprime housing mortgages and collateralized debt obligations was very small, partly because of prudence, but also partly because the financial players were less sophisticated and had not dabbled in complex structured products. However, the knock-on impact on the real economy was large. As consumer confidence in the West plunged, stock prices and exports in Asia fell off the cliff. Nearly $7 trillion of wealth was wiped off Asian stock exchanges. And Singapore, being a globally connected economy, was the first Asian country to slip into recession in the third quarter of 2008. Its growth rate in 2008 was 1.8%, down from 8.5% a year earlier. In 2009, it was minus 1.3%, from a high of 8.5 to minus 1.3 in 2009. The impact on China was much less. China lost only 2 percentage points from its double-digit growth rate in 2008. So double-digit, single-digit, 2 percentage points, China could bear it. China's main fear was massive unemployment, which could lead to social problems and chaos. To hit it off, China unveiled a $600 billion stimulus package in November 2008. That was about 12% of China's GDP. That was the size of the stimulus package. The package focused on infrastructural works and stimulating domestic consumption. To drive domestic consumption as well as production, China launched 2 stimulus programs. The first was the Home Appliances to Countryside program. Under this program, rural consumers received subsidies of up to 13% of the purchase price of home appliances. So besides driving up production of these products, the program also raised the quality of life in rural areas. For the urban population, China introduced a similar Old for New program. It provided subsidies of up to 10% for consumers who replaced their old home appliances with new ones. I'm sure in the US such a program would be welcome, had it been introduced. You exchange your old appliances for new ones, and that stimulated domestic production. So it's not just subsidizing the consumers, but it's also a means to stimulate production in China. China also expanded the coverage of medical insurance and other schemes to reduce the need for precautionary savings and hence encourage spending. Unlike Singapore, China's trade is 3 times the size of its GDP. So our economy contracted sharply in line with the fall in exports. But for us, stimulating domestic consumption would not be the answer, because whatever we would have spent on doing this would have flowed out in buying goods and services for Singapore. So what did we do? Because pump priming for us, I think, would not be the solution. So we concentrated on building resilience in the economy. First, to prevent a potential outflow of bank deposits, we put in place a blanket guarantee for all bank deposits in Singapore, including those in foreign banks in Singapore. We had to do so even though our banking system was sound, because other jurisdictions like Hong Kong, Malaysia, and Australia were doing so. Not to do so with the risk and outflow of deposits from Singapore to these countries in a time of uncertainty. Next, as banks tightened their lending, we had to ensure that our companies continued to have access to funds. This is what we call the credit squeeze phenomenon. We introduced a special risk-sharing initiative. The government shouldered the risk of up to 80% out of the loans to the banks, taking only 20% of the risk. That means for every loan that the banks made, if the loans went sour, the government would absorb 80% of the loss in the loans. So this incentivized banks to lend. We therefore avoided the credit squeeze. Third, we put in place a resilience package, not an anti-recession program to stimulate domestic consumption and production. This package cost us some $15.5 billion US, or about 8% of our GDP. The resilient package aimed to encourage employers to hold on to their workers and to upgrade their skills in readiness for the economic upturn. First, to stave off retrenchments, the government introduced a jobs credit scheme. Under the scheme, for a limited period of up to 2 years, the government provided a grant to employers to cover 12% of each local employee's wages, capped at $230 US per month. Together with other measures such as cutbacks in bonuses, reduced overtime, and in some instances, voluntary and involuntary no-pay leave, our companies were generally able to ride the downturn without having to retrench workers. So the key feature here was a flexible wage system, where wages went down instead of companies having to retrench workers. Second, we incentivized employers to use the lull period to upgrade the skills of the workers under a skills program for upgrading and resilience, or SPUR, as we call it. Under this scheme, the government subsidized up to 90% of the course fees and the payroll of those sent for training and reskilling. So this not only reduced the holding costs of keeping workers on the payroll, but also helped companies and workers to reposition themselves when growth returned. Our approach of cutting costs to save jobs, rather than cutting jobs to save costs, worked. Unemployment rose only marginally to a peak of 3.3% at the height of the crisis. And when the global economy turned the corner, our companies were able to quickly ramp up the production to meet the surge in demand. Workers were there, they were better trained than before the crisis. For this reason, our GDP growth rebounded by the massive 18% in the first half of this year. And output has recovered to a level that is even higher than the pre-crisis period. For this year, our growth is expected to be at the top end of the 13 to 15% range. I would hesitate to draw lessons from the way Singapore and China handled the financial crisis for the US, especially when I'm in the US. One, the structure, size, and complexity of the problem for the US and the Asian countries were vastly different. Second, the firestorm was in the US, while the Asian economies felt only the heat. But I want to make 4 points. One, innovative activities, richly prevalent in the US as the most productive economy in the world, carried to the extreme, can contain far-reaching risks, as seen, for example, in the IT.com bubble in the early 2000s and the recent financial crisis, which saw the widespread use of highly creative credit instruments. While innovation should not be stifled, We must understand the products fully and be aware of the attendant risks. Also, we must build up buffers to address possible spillover or tail end or tail risks. Hence, banks need to be well capitalized and corporations should not be over-leveraged. With regard to banks, this refers not only to an appropriate level of Tier 1 capital, but also its quality. 2, growth of the property sector and the stock markets must be based on underlying economic fundamentals. Regulators must be vigilant of short-term speculative bubbles, leverage off cheap liquid funds. Asia learned its lesson from the property and stock market bubble in the Asian financial crisis. In Singapore, we are always on the lookout for potential bubbles, especially in the property sector. We periodically act preemptively to let some air out of property bubbles before they burst with a bang. The use of direct and targeted tools and administrative measures, example, imposition of maximum loan-to-value ratios, stamp duties on transactions, control of land sales, have proven to be effective. Broad monetary policy actions may not be the best means since they can be blunt, and if applied too aggressively, can have unintended negative effects on the entire economy. 3, though I do not think this could be done in the US because of the size of its economy and its free market philosophy, a scheme to save jobs by sending workers for training during a recession and to reduce costs for companies may help in maintaining confidence and morale of the workers. We found that to be very important. In the recession, if you can retain the morale and confidence of the workers, that proved to be very valuable. Finally, I will reiterate that globalization is beneficial to all countries, both big and small, both developed and developing. Asia has always recognized this reality through its outward-oriented development strategies. Globalization presents both opportunities and challenges. Policymakers can no longer formulate and implement policies based on a closed economy model, which sometimes larger countries like the US might be inclined to do, at least for some sectors, under political pressure. For the next decade, I believe Asia will continue on its open growth trajectory. This will hold much economic opportunities for the US. It is better for Asia to be coupled with the US than for it to be decoupled. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we hear from Jack Wadsworth.
Mr. Senior Minister, I was much relieved that there was not a 5th item on your list, which was to use a firing squad for investment bankers.
It's coming.
Coming. Well, first of all, I'm honored to be here, and I mean that with great sincerity. Having this particular celebration coincide with, for the class of '61, the beginnings of our celebration of our own 50th reunion makes this quite special. For those members of the class of '61 who are actually here in the audience, they know that I'm not at the podium because of my academic accomplishments at Williams. But rather, let me say, as was mentioned many times during the last day or so, I did take away from this great institution the idea of critical thinking, the idea of never to accept the status quo, the idea always to ask the question, what could we do better? I wonder if that's me. think it is. It's with that it gives me great pride to say a few things about the Center for Development Economics. I think I must. We are, the class of '61, sharing this special occasion. And as many of you know, it is the tradition of the 50th reunion class at Williams to designate a particular activity, institution, subgroup at the college as the beneficiary of the class gift. Our class has chosen the Center for Development Economics to be the recipient of our gift. We have several other things, including public art, which many of us think is quite important around campus, but the main focus for us is the Center for Development Economics. And our idea, frankly, together with the visiting committee and a number of other important individual supporters, is to create an endowment for the Center for Development Economics, which will give it the ability to stand free as a part of the college. When we were here on campus, and I'll speak for myself personally, as an economics major, I was significantly influenced by Emile Dupre, by Kermit Gordon, by Bill Gates. I think in thinking of our own educational experience, it's really about that inspiration that comes from an individual professor, somebody who had a particular mark that made a difference. And it was these individuals who saw the importance of development economics and saw the idea of the center as something that they founded. And it's amazing to me that 50 years later, it is just as relevant, in fact, if not more relevant today than it was 50 years ago. And in the context of the college, as Williams itself thinks about its role in the global world, when I hear the ideas of privatization, globalization, liberalization, the challenge to this university, to this college, is to figure out where it is going to position itself in a global context, both for the students and for the future. And the Center for Development Economics is itself really a very interesting and unique activity on the campus. And the undergraduate students are more and more interacting with the CDE students and vice versa. It has now become really an integral part of the college, and therefore we, the class of '61, are particularly proud to commit to this endowment. A part of my, I think, journey to Asia, again, goes back to the experience here on Williams College. The curiosity that I received here after 25 years in Wall Street led me to Tokyo in 1987, as Jerry said, to Hong Kong in 1992. And it was that curiosity that really made quite a difference to Susie and me, my wife, in a career that I would say was really accentuated in terms of my own satisfaction of the 15 years in Asia. Let me now quickly get back on the agenda, and what I want to do is mention 5 lessons, and these are lessons that come from a practitioner, not a government official, not an academic. And let me start with the crisis of 1997-98. The first thing I'd like to mention, on July 1st, 1997, I was in Hong Kong, and that was the first day that the government of Hong Kong was in charge of Hong Kong. The British government handed them the reins in Hong Kong on June 30th, 1997. And on July 1st, the Thai baht was cut loose and the crisis of 1997 began. So as I think about my experience in Hong Kong, that government never had an opportunity to govern under normal circumstances. From the first day they walked into the office, they were faced with a crisis. And that leads me just to make a comment on currency. I think one of the things that we learned more than anything else from that experience is to free a currency to trade on capital account too soon is one of the biggest mistakes a country can make. And we saw that impact on Malaysia, on Thailand, on Indonesia, and eventually on Korea. The second point I'd like to make is about leadership. I don't think there has been enough said in the last day or so about the importance, the critical importance of leadership and the role it plays, both in institutions, in governments, in academic institutions. In the fall of 1998, I was quoted in Business Week in response to the question, what are you worried about in Asia? And I said, well, just to take two countries, I really am worried about Korea, because they have an election coming up. It's not clear who's going to run the country. I'm quite confident that Indonesia will be all right because it has very strong leadership. 2 months later, I was absolutely wrong on both accounts. Suharto got thrown out, and Kim Dae-jung came into Korea and provided the change in the leadership that made that country solid. Two really important lessons to me. The third point is what kind of economies worked during that period of time. And it's quite curious, as I looked at, and the senior minister was saying, what happened to GNP and other factors in the economy, the economies of Asia. The two countries that performed the best during that period of time were Australia and China, for completely opposite reasons. China held the course on its currency. It had a command economy. It was able to stand really outside the crisis. And on the other hand, Australia, which has one of the most efficient markets in Asia, a very efficient currency market, was able to withstand through its institutions, through its regulation, and through the way the market worked, the crisis. So it's not to say, and I think it's been said many times today, there's no one suit that fits all, and that to me was one of the greatest examples. During that period of time, I had a planning session in Hong Kong, and I asked a man who was at that time, very importantly, a mentor of mine. Many of you probably know him, Lord Gordon Richardson, who was formerly governor of the Bank of England and was then chairman of Morgan Stanley International, to come to Hong Kong and give us a dinner talk on the subject of planning for the unknown. And Gordon, as he so often was wont to do, said to me about 5 minutes before his talk, having made no preparation for it, "This is the craziest subject I've ever been given. There is no answer." But then he proceeded brilliantly to talk for 15 minutes, and at the end he said two things. Know your counterparties and never get too leveraged. And if there is any message that was more important to guide our strategy in Asia, it was those two things. And I would say we should have all remembered those two things during the last 2 years. Finally, a couple of things about China, and then I will conclude. There's some charts outside, and I encourage all of you to take one home. I'm not going to put them on the screen, and I didn't want to have them passed out, but they're, again, 5 points. The first point I call a brief history of the world. And what it shows, which I think we should always remember, is that and this is fairly sketchy data, but I think it's the best around. In 1500, China was 25% of global GDP, India was 24%, and Western Europe was 18%. The United States obviously didn't make the chart. You come down to 1950, Western Europe 26, the United States 27, China 4.5. As recently as 1820, China was 33%, and India was 16%. And what this says to me is that the perspective that we, particularly in America, have, which is a relatively short-term view of history, is not shared by China. There are 5,000 years of experience, and just in the last 500 years, China has been in leading positions from an economic point of view many times. That says to me that if they continue to do what they're doing, they will again be a leading economic nation. The second chart is about consumption. Everybody talks about consumption in China. Will it happen? Will that become a part of the economy? Our experts believe that it will, and if it does, that will really change the equation for the world, and there are many, many arguments in favor of why that will happen. The third chart is about the foreign exchange rate. Already the yuan has appreciated from about 8.2 in 2000 to what yesterday was around 6.7 to the dollar. There's tremendous pressure from the United States, now the IMF, to move the currency up more. I think there is a great debate going on in the world, really, about currency rates now. But I would encourage all of you to understand that China has read history, and it understands probably better than any nation ever has the risk of freeing up your currency too soon. And I think, therefore, they will not bow to pressure from anybody to make that mistake. The fourth chart is about their financial institutions. And we've talked a lot about financial institutions. And let me just say that, as of last week, among the 8 largest financial institutions in the world by market capitalization, the 4 big Chinese banks are on that list. This is not a mistake. It's because they have made their banks strong. They're well capitalized. They have good business models. And 5 years ago, it was not obvious that they would make it, but they have. And I think they will be important global players, and it's an important element in the strength of the Chinese economy. The final point I'd like to make is about their stock market. The Shenzhen, Shanghai stock markets are capitalized at $3 trillion as of last week. The New York Stock Exchange is capitalized at $17 trillion. The average daily trading volume in in China was $23 billion a day. In New York, it was $27 billion a day. And this is a stock market that is totally domestic. There are no institutions. It is a market that has the benefit of no cross-border capital flows. And what this says to me about Shanghai, which is really the center of the Chinese capital markets, is that it will emerge as the leading financial center in Asia once the renminbi is convertible on capital account. And I think it probably has a shot at being one of the leading financial centers of the world. So let me conclude in the following way. Progress or regress are both products of the actors and the practitioners in a dynamic system. All are critical and all spring from experiences like Williams and the CDE, and in my case, the University of Chicago. Emile Dupre, Kermit Gordon, Bill Gates inspired all of those who had a chance to learn from them, and the world, for me, became a passion to use the idea of finance to make the world a better place. In 1963, investment bankers were actually at the center of the capital market, acting as intermediaries to move capital from the holders of capital to those who needed it. I want to end with 2 stories. We created an investment bank in China called China International Capital Corporation, which is today the leading investment bank in China. And my counterpart across the table was Wang Qishan, who is now the vice premier in charge of the economy. He was then president of the China Construction Bank. He said to me that there are 2 ways to get an idea across. One is to use theory, and the other is to tell a story. He said Chinese officials much prefer stories. So I went into the world after the GSB, convinced that the capital markets were really at the center of the market economy, and that the role that they were supposed to function, that they were supposed to provide, was to supply the capital to fuel the growth of the economy. When I left the industry in 2001, retired from Hong Kong and came back to San Francisco, that function was still the same. In the last 9 years, the financial community got off track. Institutions, as Joe Stiglitz said last night, need to be moral. I'm not so sure that there is such a thing as a moral or immoral institution, but I am sure that there are individuals who are moral or immoral. And the society, in my view, has licensed the financial institutions to perform the critical intermediary function that is at the center of the economy. Here are the two stories. I act as an advisor to the Chinese government with 10 other individuals from around the world, and we meet once a year with the CSRC, which is the Chinese SEC. At the meeting in September of 2009, Shang Fulin, who is the chairman of the CSRC, opened the meeting by looking down the table at John Thornton, who is the retired co-president of Goldman Sachs, and me. And he said, in front of 80 or so people convened in the room, "We have an old Chinese saying that even the best professors become better if they are able to learn from their mistakes." Second, he said, "How does it feel to be here representing a socialist country?" And then he said, "What do you think the business models of Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley will be in 5 years?" That was a very prophetic and important question. My closing thoughts are, the socialist market economy, which is what the Chinese refer to their economy, is capitalism. And secondly, China studies history and learns from history, and that to me ensures their future. Thank you very much.
When you've had crises of this kind in the past, is there a consensus that emerges in terms of the priorities of dealing with it on the part of government? And if there isn't, how would you compare the types of differences in policy priorities that typically arise during crises of this kind in your experience with what you see in the United States today?
So the question is, are there priorities, or are you asking like sort of rules of thumb for the government officials in dealing with crises? Okay. From our government officials, if you want to take.
Yes, I'll take that. It depends on the perspective of the problems of each government. So you cannot have, as Jack put it, a one-size-fits-all kind of approach to the crisis. So the government would have to assess what will be the impact on its own economy. Is it on, say, for example, the currency, the financial sector, or on the real economy, unemployment, and so on? Then what would be the priority? I would think that most governments would be concerned as to the impact on employment. Because if unemployment shoots up during a crisis, then you're going to face real political problems. So the approach will be on how to, I think, ensure that there be growth as much as possible, and or ensure that employment would not spike up, so that you do not have to deal with the unemployment problem. That was the case for China's approach in the current crisis, Singapore's approach as well, and also I think similar for the other countries in Asia. Fortunately for us in Asia, we did not let the 1997-1978 crisis go to waste. Out of the crisis, we learned many lessons. And because we learned the lessons, For example, we're not allowing corporations to be over-leveraged or banks to be over-leveraged. This time, the impact on us on the financial sector was limited because of the lessons that we learned. And the other lessons that we learned was quick, decisive action. Don't dilly-dally. If you debate too much, like in your case in Congress, you would never come to a decision. Republicans, Democrats arguing over very important challenges, looking for solutions when the fire was burning very, very brightly and very hot. So the lesson we learned was take decisive action very quickly. And of course, you've got to have the experience to take the necessary correct decisions. And if you do not, you must have the wisdom to be able to make a U-turn very quickly, the moment you see that your decisions are not quite right. In our case, because we had gone through the Asian financial crisis earlier, the governments also cooperated. We have the ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations grouping. And ASEAN also had its dialogue partners with China, Korea, Japan. So when this present crisis took place, the leaders met to exchange notes, what we would do. And together we tried to inspire confidence in the entire region, which of course would also allow us to inspire confidence in particular economy. So that's the approach which we took in the previous crisis as well as the current crisis.
Mauricio, do you want to add anything?
Yes, just to add a practical objective with the authorities is to avoid to seize the payment system. Try to protect the payment system. Otherwise, if you will find, for instance, small institutions with payment problems, it can spread a contagion to all the systems. So to protect the payment system is very crucial at the beginning of the problem. I don't know if something that is in my head about the problem in the U.S. is the amount of the subprime loans. Because everybody talks about the subprime loans, and the problem is just about 15% of the portfolio of all the banks. This is the figures that I have. So something went wrong in the way the authorities work with the American crisis, because if it is just the subprime loans, 15% of the total portfolio, something has been wrong to the way it managed the crisis. Maybe it was too proactive, or the contagion to the other institutions were so fast, or maybe the decision with Lehman Brothers was not the right decision at this moment. Thank you.
Another question here.
I'd like to ask a question in relation to the solutions that both China and Singapore handle the current situation. It seems to be premised on a large level of savings. And the large level of savings enable you to make quick, decisive action, where it's not possible in a country with no savings. You have to go to the taxpayers. All those representing taxpayers will have to delay whether that burden is shared. So this is the fundamental difference. Where they have the foresight to build up the savings, and so when the crisis comes around, you can make your decisions quickly and address it quickly at one point. But related also to the other point of Mr. Wadsworth's observations about what's happening in China capital market. Very interesting thing about the market size. We talk about volume per day, I'm not sure it was per day, per month, whatever. Very near the US markets. But if you look at those shares that were traded, same shares listed in other markets, they don't allow cross-border, but they allow cross-listing. What is listed in Hong Kong and traded in China, what's traded in China and listed in Hong Kong. And price multiples are entirely different. I've heard of price multiple 72 times against a 14. So that when you have these kind of adjustments, maybe the volumes are not such significantly different. So perhaps you can pick these all up together with the savings equation. Thank you.
Okay, so two questions. First, I guess to Minister Go, do the savings rates constrain or influence the policy choices?
I would say absolutely, and it's also the experience that we had from the Asian financial crisis, that you got to have ammunition to fight the crisis. So that ammunition is savings. That's the reserves that we have. And the Asian countries understood that, and after the Asian financial crisis, I would say practically every country had ample savings. So in this particular crisis, we had that ammunition. Again, just to illustrate, in the case of Singapore, because we had the savings, we could use those savings to have a jobs credit scheme plus other schemes, which amounted to about 8% of the GDP. In our case, we have a special arrangements where we will not be able to tap into past reserves without the President's approval. Past reserves mean the reserves accumulated by the previous government, even though it's the same Prime Minister and the same ministers in charge. This is to prevent anybody from trying to raid the reserves of the past. So in this particular instance, we went to the President to say there was a crisis, and we need to have the reserves to be able to have a massive package to build resilience in the economy. And of course, permission was granted by the President. So your point is absolutely right. You must have that savings. So countries without savings, what do? I think their hands will be tight. You've got to go to the market to borrow. And in the crisis, when you go to the market to borrow, your interest rates will be very high. That is going to compound the problem. You get into a vicious cycle of borrowing, and if the crisis doesn't blow over quickly, then your capacity to repay, I think, would be rather limited.
Okay, thank you. And Jack, the issue, I guess, is does the practice of cross-listing influence the numbers?
Well, let me just add to what the senior minister said. I think the other component is very smart, very decisive leadership. You can have dry powder, you can have reserves, you can have savings, but if you don't have really good leadership, making those quick decisions is tough. And the United States, of course, is an exception to what you said. We have no savings, but we can print money. So we can act quickly. On the subject of the dual shares, I think, let me put it this way, one of the great secrets to China's success is the fact that Hong Kong is one of the most efficient capital markets in the world, and it lies within the borders of China. There has never been a developing country in the history of the world that has had that advantage. And China has used that advantage extraordinarily well. What China was growing on before they began issuing shares in the international markets was foreign direct investment, which was running at the rate of about $50 billion a year and growing. That too is unique. I don't think there's ever been a country with a blocked currency that has ever experienced that kind of inward capital flows. It's partly a function of the attractiveness of China as an investment, but it's also a function of 50 million overseas Chinese, who are one of the loyal factors in the history of China in terms of returning capital home. By issuing H shares, N shares, all of these internationally traded shares, which are not fungible with the A shares in China, they have been able to supplement that capital flow in big years as much as 100 billion of inward flows through the sale of shares. That is totally independent of the shares trading locally. So I think the answer to your question is a difficult one. These really are phenomena that are independent, of the government and its own liquidity, aside from the issuance and privatization of shares which has come into the international capital market. And that will change the day the renminbi becomes convertible on capital account, and that's when those price-earnings ratios will come together, but not until.
Thank you. I think we have time for just one more question, so we'll go ahead. Yep.
Yes, hi, I'm Win, and I'm sovereign college and also income major. My question has to do with foreign reserves and sovereign wealth funds. We all know that China has China Investment Corporation, which has over $300 billion in assets. We also know that Singapore also has the GIC, which is also valued as one of the largest foreign wealth funds in the world. So how have these foreign wealth funds been used in the past crisis in dealing with the issues we have to deal with? And what role will they continue to play in the future in the unlikely event, perhaps, that we run into the next crisis, or how would they help the Indian countries in growing their economies and also in cooperating with other nations across the world? Thank you.
Okay, so I guess it's the impact of sovereign wealth funds on managing the crisis. I think.
Well, I think the sovereign wealth funds, as far as Singapore is concerned, I think that's also the case in the other countries too. They are actually set up to invest the reserves in the best way possible. So it represents huge reserves, which of course we should not tap into unnecessarily. They are meant to earn further reserves for the future, earnings for the future. And in the crisis, you do not need to tap into the sovereign wealth funds. It's actually managed outside the government by a separate board. And it's an arm's length kind of arrangements, because you do not want to actually intervene too much with the decisions taken by the people who will be investing the funds. And if you have to dig into those reserves, but in the finance ministry, we actually have those reserves which need not be managed by the sovereign wealth funds, because every government must have its own reserves at any one time, I think for intervention purposes, like in the case of a central bank. So it is a separate issue. So in a crisis, if you really need the funds to intervene, then of course you would then have to tap into the sovereign wealth funds to have the necessary resources to intervene in a crisis. By this crisis, I think most of us did not have to worry about the sovereign wealth funds.
Okay, thank you very much. I am very dismayed to have to cut this short, but in order to make our 6 o'clock dinner and then our 8 o'clock talk with Danny Roderick, we have to adjourn. Please join me in thanking the panel.